here. So pleased to welcome you to Harlaxton Manor. So many of you will know us. I see lots of our friends in the audience and some of our team members, and some of you won't know us. So for those of you who don't know us well, we're an American study abroad site, an amazing events venue, and what I would argue is probably the most beautiful manor house in the country, but I'll let you decide. I'm sort of paid to say it's the nicest one, but you might think differently. So, this morning we have this beautiful symposium put together, really by Alan Packwood. I don't want to take credit for the symposium, it was not my baby, but I can tell you it's been in very safe hands and you will have an amazing morning.
I should also say that our dinner last night was particularly special because Holly's remarkable catering team managed to replicate the menu that Churchill and Roosevelt had for their first meeting on the battleship the Prince of Wales off Newfoundland in 1941, where they first signed the Atlantic Conference Agreement. So we reenacted a battleship lunch at dinner last night, very remarkable, including the grouse. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Ambassador Matthew Palmer. He has had a distinguished 30-year career as a diplomat with postings across Europe and staff postings back in Washington. Just noticing the languages he speaks, Serbian, Greek and Japanese, you have some idea of the breadth of his experience, but we are delighted to...
I think the lesson, frankly, that I would draw from my presence here this morning is that the election is not my job. So good morning, everyone. Good morning. Oh, come on. We've already been through this. Thank you to Holly Carter, thank you to James Birch, thank you to those of you who are here to speak or to present papers at this conference. Thank you to Lord Stuart Peach for extending me the honor of an invitation, and to Lord Soames, who is not here with us this morning, but who delivered what I thought was a really powerful, thoughtful, and engaging speech last night at dinner. A few thoughts, if I may, about Winston Churchill and the quote-unquote special relationship. I'm reminded some of the philosopher Spinoza, who rejected formalized religion, but believed that God was everywhere and in everything. The special relationship is not some set of formal rules or dogma, but whenever you examine it, Churchill is everywhere and in everything. Of course, it was Churchill who first coined the term, and through word and deed cultivated it. The titanic struggle between democracy and fascism in the early half of the 20th century was the foreground and the impetus. But Churchill's cajoling, prodding, and sometimes fierce friendship with President Roosevelt helped give it depth and dimension. Here, on the 150th anniversary of Churchill's birth, more than 78 years since he formally used those iconic words during the speech in Fulton, Missouri. What is the real meaning of the real special relationship? What is its true and enduring value? I've been here in the United Kingdom for a little more than 2 years myself now, bordering 2.5. And when I arrived, of course, I knew of the special relationship. I understood the close alliance with the United Kingdom, but I was aware of some other impressions as well. In British-American relations, the term itself is somewhat sacrosanct, and like a Hail Mary or an Our Father or another sacred blessing, there is a perceived value in saying it aloud and then saying it again. You all would be forgiven for believing its repetition was a necessary condition of employment in the diplomatic corps. As a result, some knowing, maybe jaded journalists roll their eyes at the mention of the special relationship, believing the phrase itself has long since worn out its welcome. To the cynical, it's a substitute for serious cooperation. As the tinny sound of a chair leg scratching a spot on the floor worn down by decades of use. But to the believers, and I confess that I number myself among them, the phrase carries the reassuring resonance of wartime triumph. To them, to us, it captures the spirit of an exceptional alliance between two countries, which at the time didn't take naturally to alliances. For the forward-looking, the special relationship implies a steady rhythm of collaboration between the United States and the United Kingdom, as well as a transatlantic code, which promises that no matter what challenges come our way, things will probably be okay in the end. The truth is, the special relationship means many different things to many different people. It describes several different attributes of our partnership. Its closeness and its openness, its strength and its shrewdness, but also the very real affection that our two countries have for each other. I, for one, have found that there is something extraordinary and unique about the level of trust here in this relationship, in this partnership. The number of people that we have working inside one another's governments, the sensitivity of the intelligence that we share, the almost instinctive sense of shared goals. We're in the same huddle, on the same team, in the same sport of global affairs. I can truly say that I've never experienced anything like this, been part of any relationship like this in 32 years of representing the United States abroad. There's one other attribute, however, that stands out to me about our special relationship. Maybe it's most important. I found that the relationship between the US and the UK has the remarkable ability to evolve, sometimes subtly, sometimes substantially, to confront very different conditions and challenges. In the nearly 80 years between Churchill's Missouri speech and our gathering together here today, the world has changed many times, undergone multiple epical shifts in the drivers of world affairs. A transatlantic alliance forged in war grew to help rebuild a continent devastated by it. The alliance evolved again to confront Soviet communism and managed a long Cold War across every continent. When the wall came down, again it shifted purpose to offer a new wave of democracies support and to take advantage of the burgeoning prosperity of the internet age. In the last 20 years, our alliance has swung from a focus on international terrorism and the rise of adversarial non-state actors to a renewed focus on peer competitors like China and Russia, and a new axis of adversaries in the Middle East, led by Iran and its proxies, and global threats like pandemics and climate change. The world is maddeningly complex and ever-changing. In my mind, the often unspoken power of the special relationship is its ability to adapt and evolve in response to these tectonic shifts, and reorganize our military, political, social, and economic cooperation along entirely new dimensions to meet the moment. That adaptability, that flexibility, that elasticity, that's the secret sauce that makes this special relationship so different and so essential. It's why I can say with absolute certainty that the greatest asset we have in managing the challenges of the middle part of the 21st century is and will continue to be the remarkable alliance between our two great democracies. So when we think of AI and cybersecurity, when we think of climate change and the energy transition, when we think of rising authoritarianism and shifting multilateralism, it's the special relationship that gives us confidence we can adapt to these challenges as we have together for centuries. Now I have a bit of formal business that I must attend to. You see, according to Article 3, Paragraph 14, subsection C of the secret charter that governs the special relationship, I am under the strictest obligation to, at some point in these remarks, quote the Venerable Winston Churchill, as all American officials must. As you well know, I'm certain my British counterparts are, according to paragraph 15 of the same statute, they're obligated to quote Abraham Lincoln or John F. Kennedy. Either party may deploy Shakespeare or Mark Twain without prior consultation. So before I close, please allow me to fulfill my duty, my responsibility, not by quoting Churchill's Fulton, Missouri speech, but rather an address he made to the House of Commons 6 years before he landed on that iconic phrase, reflecting on the future course of the United Kingdom's destiny in partnership with the United States. Churchill compared the relationship to the unrelenting force of the great Mississippi River. I could not stop it, he said, even if I wished. No one can stop it. So let it roll on, full flood, inexorable, irresistible, to broader lands and better days. So with gratitude for invitation and hospitality, I say as well, let it roll on, full flood. Well, thank you all for the invitation, and I'm happy to take a couple of questions if you all would like, and I believe there's a microphone.
I have a microphone.
Yeah, Holly's got the microphone. So, anyone's got any questions, raise your hand. Before we get to the questions, I'll answer 80% of them. I have no idea what happens on November 5th. I do know what happens on November 6th, which is the Republic will be fine and the special relationship will be strong and vital no matter who wins on the 5th of November. We'll put that aside. But if you want to talk about the election, I'm happy to do that too. But whatever really is on your mind, Holly's got a mic. Don't all talk at once. Someone's got to go first.
Thank you. You've mentioned how the relationship has evolved a lot and has been very robust throughout time, but what have been the biggest challenges that it's managed to withstand?
Well, I think that the biggest challenge is really just change, right? I mean, you've got a relationship fit to purpose, a partnership fit to purpose to fight fascism, to fight Nazi Germany, Italy, Japan. After the war, a changed set of circumstances. You have the immediate need to rebuild the devastated continent. You have the need to rally the democratic world in defense of Europe against the encroaching communist threat that led by Moscow and which had global reach. The special relationship adapted to the point where it was central and fundamental to the challenges of the Cold War period. 1989, the fall of the wall, a new set of challenges. I believe the phrase at the time was, the dragon may be dead, but the woods are full of snakes, right? So who were we partnered with? Hunting snakes in the jungle. The new threats, the transnational threats of terrorism and globalized organized crime, narco-trafficking. Again, it was the US-UK relationship that was the bedrock of this. After 9/11, the global war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, who's standing shoulder to shoulder? The United States and the United Kingdom. I look today at the threats of instability in the Middle East, and who is it that's keeping the sea lanes of communication open? Who's protecting free trade and global commerce, moving through the Red Sea? It's the United States, the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force. We're working together as partners in defense of common values and the interests of the global community.
I hope you saw him taking notes as well.
Yeah, no, it's very important. There'll be a quiz on this.
It's a group of students from Loughborough, so we're very happy to have them today. Debbie.
Master, 8 years ago, there were roughly 1 million Americans in Nicosia joining us in World War II in a particular conflict that we still remember as Arnhem. How important is it to take us back to that alliance that, in fact, Churchill encouraged by saying, I want some of those guys that can drop out of the sky, i.e. your paratroopers. And how important is it, do you think, to be recalling that time as we remember our special relationship now?
Right. I think it's tremendously important that we never forget the sacrifices that so many young people made in that particularly dark period of world history. It is an inspiration. It is a lesson. There are reasons to look back on that period and with pride on the accomplishments. But at the same time, I don't think we need to look back on some golden era in the special relationship that has been lost to us. The relationship that we enjoy today is equally close. It's equally vibrant. It's fit to purpose. It is alive. It is functional. It is meeting our needs and the needs of our ally. So I'm a little bit hesitant about the idea that we look back as something lost. This lost era of common purpose. We maintain a sense of common purpose. And it's easy sometimes, I think, to look back on 80 years ago and say there was no friction in the relationship 80 years ago. And anyone who spends 10 minutes looking at the history knows that that is not true. There's all kinds of friction. A relationship of equals requires a degree of friction. I've been married for 30 years. It is not a friction-free experience. It's not supposed to be, right? That one party is not to subordinate his or her interests to the interests of the other, or the power of personality of the other. It's a partnership of equals. A partnership of equals always involves a certain degree of give and take. Look at the history of the relationship between Montgomery and Eisenhower. Holy moly, that was not an easy partnership. It was not an easy relationship, but it was extraordinarily productive, and it was effective, and it ultimately advanced the interests of both of our countries. And that's what's at the core, I believe, of the special partnership, the special relationship. What my boss now routinely calls the essential relationship, which I think is a good way to describe it as well. May not be as lasting as Churchill's description, but it's a good way to conceive of it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I just think it's just wonderful to be able to recognise the impact that particularly Harlaxton had on hosting and, yeah.
Absolutely. No, we're gathered here for a reason, right?
We have a question here.
Ambassador, can I ask you, do you consider that the United States of America and Great Britain is aligned completely over Ukraine at the present time?
Yes. The word completely is a slippery one, right? In that the United States itself is not aligned completely with itself, right? And the United Kingdom is not aligned completely with itself. One of the oldest aphorisms in Washington is where you stand depends on where you sit, right? Meaning that you're part of an institution, the institution has a perspective, that the perspectives are necessarily going to be different. So we have this interagency process in the United States. The White House leads the National Security Council, the State Department is there. We want to see a Ukraine that is secure in its borders. We want to see a Ukraine that is stable, that is peaceful, that is democratic, that is integrating into European and Euro-Atlantic institutions, including the European Union and NATO. This is the ambition that we have. Getting there is going to be a difficult, painful, costly process. And there will be along the way debates about how to best pursue those goals. The differences, in my view, to the extent they exist, are essentially tactical in nature. Strategically, our understanding of the problem set and our goals and ambitions are as close to identical as to be of no interest otherwise. I think I can take one more.
One more question.
Sure. If there is one more, I'll take it.
I saw one here.
So thank you very much indeed. At the time the special relationship was formed, we as a country were probably at our height in terms of power and influence around the world. Over the years we've seen that decline, and probably more rapidly. We are less, I think, in terms of influential in the world. Do you see we have a continual role and the impact on the relationship with America, particularly we're competing against so many other powerful nations now?
Sure. The world is a complex place. We've seen the rise of peer competitors. I think there is maybe an over eagerness in pursuing the narrative of declinism. And you look at the stuff that really matters. You look at the advances in artificial intelligence. You look at what's going on with gene editing technology. You look at what's going on with reusable rockets or clean technology. The leaders, the drivers of this, it's the United States and our allies and partners, including, I think, at the forefront of this, the United Kingdom. There are certain advantages that the UK has that will make it continually and continuously relevant to managing global challenges, including a seat on the Security Council, an independent strategic nuclear deterrent, a strong and dynamic science-based economy, and I would argue fundamental to the UK's global strength is the relationship, the partnership, the special relationship that it enjoys with the United States. So I'm not really concerned that somehow we collectively are in decline. We have a competitor. I think you can't look at Beijing as being other than a peer competitor and growing as an adversary, in the sense that what Beijing wants, how Beijing would like the world to be structured, is very different from the way that we would like the world to be structured. But the strength of our alliance relationships is a unique advantage vis-a-vis Beijing. They don't have anything like that. They don't have anything like the network of allies and partners that have supported the global order that we built together and that has provided 80 years of relative peace, prosperity, and stability. So looking ahead, I'm optimistic about the future. I'm optimistic about the US-UK partnership. Thank you for that. Thank you all for that.
Thank you so much for those remarks. I think it sets us up perfectly for the discussions that are now going to take place. And if I can invite my panel, the first panel, to come up and take their seats on stage, please.
Right. So let's crack on, and let me start by giving some context for this first session and a few key thoughts on the World War II relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt. On the 5th of March 1946, as we've already heard, Winston Churchill spoke at Westminster College, Fulton, Missouri, less than 300 miles from Evansville, I think, having been introduced by President Harry Truman. And in words reported around the globe, he spoke deliberately of a special relationship between the United States and the British Commonwealth. And in fact, of course, the need for a strategic partnership with the United States had been a fairly constant feature of Churchill's worldview, really from the First World War through to the 1950s. And his final advice to his cabinet on retirement in 1955 was never be separated from the Americans. Advice, of course, which Anthony Eden immediately ignored by going into Suez. But of course, you know, the special relationship, it hasn't always been there. Forgive me for this, but on the 24th of August 1814, British troops entered Washington, D.C. and burnt down the White House and other public buildings. And of course, it's really, in the scale of things, not that long ago. Churchill was born on the 30th of November 1874. We're celebrating his 150th anniversary this year. So he's born only 60 years after those events. Events when a war between Britain and the United States was very much within living memory. And I think that emphasises that we tend to take Churchill's special relationship for granted. As the ambassador said, it's become the staple line trotted out by presidents, prime ministers, politicians, media commentators. It's become that sort of sacred line. But we very rarely stop to think about how and why it came about, how it has evolved and changed over time, exactly what we were talking about, and what it really means for us today. And I think that's what's important about this gathering. These sessions are not going to be a simple glorification of our relationship over the last 80 years or so, because that would become very boring and very repetitive very quickly. What I think these sessions should do is delve into the nuance and the detail of a strategic partnership that has waxed and waned over time and which has faced many challenges, many changes, many evolutions. And I think if we want to continue to work together and to shape a common future, we have to understand what has divided us as well as what has brought us together. So this is going to be about the Anglo-American relationship, what Churchill often called the union of the English-speaking peoples in all its complexity. Churchill was half American by birth. His mother was the Brooklyn-born beauty Jenny Jerome, but of course he was born into the highest levels of the British aristocracy at the zenith of the British Empire. He was educated in the British public school system and in the British Army before being elected to the Westminster Parliament at the age of just 25 in 1900, joining the cabinet a few years later in 1908. In his early years, he was generally well disposed to the United States, visiting in 1895 and again in 1900, even if he did describe American newspapers as vulgarity divested of truth. But in his youth, of course, he saw Britain as the dominant force in that English-speaking world. And I think all of that really changes with the First World War, because he's forced to watch as the new world, the United States, comes to the rescue of the old. As Minister of Munitions in 1917 to 18, he sees at first hand the power of American industry and technology. He sees the exposure of the weakness of the British imperial position, especially when faced with new enemies rising from the ashes of the older European empires. But American isolationism and the Monroe Doctrine meant that further American support for Britain in a new war against a remilitarized and expansionist Nazi Germany was not a given. As wartime Prime Minister from May 1940, Churchill was faced almost immediately with military defeat in France. And as a result, he's being told by his chiefs of staff from the very beginning of his premiership that Britain would only be able to fight on if full financial and economic support could be obtained from the United States. Without which, the British military leaders concluded, we do not think we could continue the war with any chance of success. Small wonder then that Churchill devotes so much time to courting President Roosevelt, telling his private secretary, Jock Colville, no lover studied every whim of his mistress as I did those of President Roosevelt. I think that the Anglo-American relationship during the war can be crudely categorised into three phases: courtship, marriage, and marital difficulties. We don't have time to go into all of those in detail, but I'll just give the broad outlines of each. So the courtship phase. Between May 1940 and December 1941, Churchill is desperate to secure an American alliance, and he launches a concerted charm offensive, conducted in public through his great speeches, like the one that the ambassador quoted, most of which do include specific passages aimed at the American audience, while also in private entertaining the president's emissaries and bombarding Roosevelt with private appeals for more aid. Roosevelt, of course, was keen to see that Britain did not fall, and he gradually authorises more and more measures of support, giving 50 old destroyers in exchange for various British bases, introducing Lend-Lease as a way of giving crucial supplies while also bypassing US neutrality laws, and assuming more and more responsibility for the defence of the Western Atlantic, including the garrisoning of Iceland. But none of that, of course, came for free, and Churchill likened the actions of the US in stripping British gold reserves to that of a sheriff collecting the last assets of a hapless debtor. Of course, together, Churchill and Roosevelt draw up the Atlantic Charter in August 1941, a set of principles for world governance, even though Churchill knew that the provisions regarding self-determination of nations had the potential to weaken the British Empire. But there was still no American declaration of war, and it took the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 for the Anglo-American marriage to be consummated. 1942 to 43 marks the high point of the Anglo-American wartime alliance. And you have this unprecedented political and military partnership, most visible in the Combined Chiefs of Staff organisation, which leads to British troops serving under American theatre commanders and vice versa. And of course it leads to the strategy which leads to victory in Europe being hammered out for a series of gruelling top-level conferences. That wasn't always easy. Churchill probably did not say that the Americans could only be trusted to do the right thing once all other alternatives had been exhausted. But he definitely did say that the only thing worse than fighting with allies was fighting without them. And as the war continued, that was clearly exacerbated for him by the increasing dominance of American production and troop numbers. After the Tehran conference, he laments the fact that, there he is, the sort of the poor Englishman trapped between the American buffalo and the Russian bear, but only he knows the right way home. Those marital difficulties, I think, become more acute once the defeat of Nazi Germany is assured and the thoughts of Roosevelt and Churchill start to turn to the post-war world. Because the two leaders had very different visions for the peace. Churchill was fighting for the return of the British Empire of 1939. Roosevelt was keen to establish a new international order under the United Nations. Churchill wanted a continuation of the strong wartime military and political alliance, while many in the United States at that point were wary that he was trying to get them to prop up the British Empire. The war certainly strengthened ties of culture and bonds of friendship, but as we moved from hot war to cold war, there remained very different national interests. And I'm going to stop there because I think this is something I feel our next two speakers may well be going to pick up on. Dr. James Greenhalgh is an Associate Professor in History in the School of History and Heritage at the University of Lincoln. He specialises in urban and cultural histories of 19th and 20th century Britain and is an expert, among other things, on the Blitz, especially on its impact on Hull. But today he's prepared, specially for us, a case study on Anglo-American post-war relations. And his presentation is entitled, "We Must Not Lose Sight of the Germany We Hope Will Emerge, Denazification and the Fault Lines of the Special Relationship." James.
Okay, so to get the procedural stuff out of the way, unlike Alan, I'm not going to taunt anyone about the War of 1812. You may have had to repaint the White House, but you did get a great national anthem out of it. So I'm going to talk about some of that friction, and I'm going to talk about that moment where the special relationship, as it's in its embryonic form, has turned from what Alan described as the high point of cooperation into the bit where they're trying to decide what the world is going to look like when the war is won. So this is about denazification. I'm sorry I haven't got time to go through denazification in detail. It does really what it says on the tin. It's the attempt to eradicate both the Nazis and the taint, if you like, of Nazism from Germany and to a lesser extent Austria. Compulsory Churchill quote incoming, Churchill's suggestion of rounding up the top Nazis and shooting them was rejected. For a much larger and much more complex Sisyphean task of attempting to arrest the top Nazis whilst trying to assess whether around 20 million Germans had in fact been committed Nazis through a system of questionnaires which was organised by zone. So a lot of the conflict that stems from the formulation of denazification policy, which I'm going to talk about, stems from the fact that the jurisdiction for it between the British and the Americans in what emerges the zones of their influence it is going to be shared with some overlaps. So one of the reasons I've chosen to look at denazification and its formulation, so I'm not going to look at its implementation because it fades very quickly from the early high ideals faced with the potential for Germany to starve, maintaining coal production, and of course the emergence of Germany as a sort of key buffer state against the Cold War. The reason I think denazification is interesting to look at in 43 and 44 and 45 is because it was an ill-defined policy from the start and effectively unworkable, and in that it generates its own conflicts which act as a window into some of the testing issues of Anglo-American relations and the reasons that the Allies started to struggle to see eye to eye. Even so, what I want to focus on here is really just a small slice of what's going on, which shows the challenges of dealing for the British civil service in particular and British political culture with their American counterparts. So where I'm going to start is with the formulation of Anglo-American policy and I'm mainly going to talk about a cast of characters whose names you don't need to remember, who were all civil servants in various different parts of things like the Foreign Office and the German Department. So the Anglo-American differences on denazification formulation can be seen as early as 1943, but it's really in the summer of 1944 when in attempts to produce a Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, which I'm going to refer to as CHEF from now on, to produce an occupation handbook, that we see the real issues emerge. In the first draft, the British argued that they should be able to retain certain sections of the Gestapo and police to ensure order. But the Americans strongly, and I think perhaps understandably, opposed this, reasoning that these functions were by nature too ideologically contaminated. And this is where we start to see what's going on between the British and the Americans. The British are very, very pragmatic, and at this stage the Americans are a little bit more ideological. So after much wrangling, by the fifth revision of this, Con O'Neill, then the Secretary of the Subcommittee of the Post-Hostilities Planning Committee, try saying that one a few times, still felt that the directives were too strict concerning the dismissal of Nazi personnel. And he was supported by his superior marshal, who agreed that the American proposal sought a drastic purge that would have repercussions for efficiency in the zone. Now, this British emphasis on efficiency and economic success would be a consistent issue for them right into the implementation of denazification policy, because they suspected that their American counterparts, at least this stage, had little regard for the traditional balance of power and general functioning of Europe, something that Alan alluded to. So Trautbeck, the head of the German section of the Foreign Office, thus regarded with contempt, and his contempt is extremely evident on the page, an American amendment to the same edition of the handbook, which proposed that no steps should be taken towards the economic rehabilitation of Germany. And Trautbeck said it was obvious that such measures would be vital if Britain was to, quote, get anything out of Germany. Now, the final drafting of the CHEF handbook at this stage appeared, very briefly, to represent a small triumph for this group of British civil servants and their attempts to maintain a German administrative and economic efficiency in the post-war. However, given a copy in August, Morgenthau, he of the Morgenthau Plan, returned to America concerned that the handbook seemed to point the way towards the rebuilding of Germany rather than its destruction, which was, of course, entirely the point for the British. Roosevelt immediately ordered the withdrawal of the handbook and condemned its intentions, writing that every German must recognise that the whole nation has been involved in a lawless conspiracy against the decencies of modern civilization. Now, it certainly wasn't the case that the British were in outlook more lenient per se than the Americans. British politicians were, aside from a small minority, not minded to be ameliorative to their enemy. And Churchill and Eden, if you go and look through Alan's archival materials, only seemed to object to American plans for denazification when it appeared that they were treating Britain as a junior partner. In one letter, Churchill writes to Harry Hopkins in 1944 and castigates him for attempts to issue a Joint Chiefs of Staff directive which would have force in the British zone. Moreover, there are plenty of examples of British inconsistency, application of the denazification process in brutal manners in some famous cases. And so far as a clear pattern can be observed, what the early examples suggest is that the British tended to be a little bit more pragmatic and favoured the ability to make decisions on a case-by-case basis. So I'm not trying to condemn the Americans here as being ideologues. It's just in this early stage they are a little bit more idealistic about the world that they want to create. So I think some of the explanation for these differences can be found in the fact that the British approaches were being formulated by a civil servant class that prided itself in finding solutions to problems that were independent of political ideologies and party positions. And this is in evidence in spades throughout this material. So when the first attempt at a joint policy was issued under the aegis of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff, unlike Churchill and Eden's objections over jurisdiction, the civil services objections were encapsulated in their objection to an instruction that said all members of the Nazi Party and ardent supporters of Nazism will be removed immediately from all government positions and from all leading positions in industry, banking, education, the judiciary and other public services. This note was met with incredulity by O'Neill and Troutbeck et al., who objected on the grounds that the number of arrests necessary would be impossible and the directions were themselves vague. Ivor Pink, who was a departmental undersecretary, believed the prohibited retention of known Nazis in administrative positions was in fact desirable in the short term for the smooth running of the British zone. Now again, to cast the Americans as ideologues in this would be to go too far. By the time denazification was implemented, Morgenthau's plan to reduce Germany to an agrarian society had been discredited, and Truman had replaced Roosevelt. However, the issue was that the British civil service simply did not trust American intentions, recognising that in these early stages, American zeal could be the enemy of rebuilding a prosperous Germany and a stable Europe that more closely resembled the world that the British had dominated. It's therefore easy to detect one of the main clefts between the Allies that Alan talked about. For Britain, the aim was to revert as closely as possible to something resembling the established order of things, whilst for the Americans, the end of the war represented an attempt to reshape the world into a new order. And this was being played out in microcosm over these denazification policies. There is another element to this story that I want to add in, though, and it speaks to the mutual mistrust between the Allies and the political culture of the two nations. In October 1944, E.W. Playfair wrote again to Con O'Neill on the question of how to treat German civil servants. He'd spoken to colleagues in Italy where they had been doing the same process of defascisation, who had confirmed that Italian civil servants, whom Playfair himself had recommended as reliable, honest and competent, were at present twiddling their thumbs whilst waiting for clearance, despite the ministries in Italy being short of the very people. He added, "The whole thing is 100% inefficient. It leads me more and more to think that whatever basis we have for purging, the main point is that it should be done quickly, even at the cost of personal injustice." Of course, to the British, the notion that civil servants were typically both the right types, a word that carries so much meaning in this era, and politically neutral was, if not axiomatic, then at least largely beyond doubt. But their entreaties to American counterparts tended to fall on deaf ears in this direction, with Playfair declaring that the present policy was hard to understand, given that the British and the Americans had experience with these European civil servants before the war. And when Troutbeck wrote back, he said, "There is no ground," this is a longish quote, I apologise, "there is no ground in practice for assuming that every state secretary and ministerial director is a Nazi. Many of them are regular civil servants of the kind we most want to keep. Surely there are plenty of civil servants who enjoyed the full confidence of the Nazi authorities because the Nazi authorities were the German government, and these were men of a professional civil service class and good patriots. We cannot wish to only work with turncoats." By way of example, take my friend Bergman. He would be out under the current rules, as he is now, I am told, Ministerial Director of the Ministry of Transport. He is one of our most competent men and is as reliable as you could wish to find. So I think here there is a sense that the British, at least to my mind, still inhabit a much older world. Their thinking belongs in that old world, in which a pre-war civil service interacted with each other across international boundaries, and in which Nazism is almost cast as just a poor choice of government. The idea of casting off much of the machinery of government was unthinkable to the British in any circumstances, in a way that simply isn't true for the American political system. And indeed, I want to end this by going a little bit further than I have done, and to take this thought a little bit further. Because the British attachment to the idea of what the civil service was and their relationship to the Nazi government, to me reminds me of what sociologist Zygmunt Bauman and Hannah Arendt would talk about later on, which was, for the British civil service, there was a "there but for the grace of God go I" that is summed up by some of these sentiments. And I'm going to leave you with a quote from one member of the Intelligence and Security Committee discussing how to feel when in Germany and weighing the guilt of Germans against the suffering that he was observing during the winter of 1945-46. And he said the following: "Two kinds of guilt must be broadly distinguished amongst the Germans, although of course they overlap. On one hand is the guilt of those who formed and were directly concerned with executing Nazi foreign and domestic policy in its worst aspects. On the other hand is the guilt of those who sat by passively or carried out orders unthinkingly, who did not know or would not know the worst horrors of Nazism. It does not seem to me the guilt of those latter people differs in kind, although in degree it does, from the guilt of those outside Germany who found it more comfortable to forget the seamy side of Nazism and thought it possible, even in 1938, to do business with Hitler. Let the Englishman who saw from the first the true nature of Nazism and is confident that he would have risked the concentration camp to oppose it, to arm himself with indifference against the suffering of German women and children." Thanks very much.
Former Churchill College Archives Fellow. He's written extensively on Anglo-American relations, most notably on the Vietnam War, European integration, nuclear history, as well as studies of Winston Churchill and of Anthony Eden. For the past year, he's also been involved in the campaign for justice for British nuclear test veterans from the 1950s, whose health was affected by exposure to radiation, and his work is going to feature on a BBC documentary due to air next month. This morning he's going to talk about Winston Churchill and the not-so-special nuclear relationship with the United States, 1945 to 55. Kevin.
Thank you, Alan. Good morning, everybody. I think it's fair to say that Winston Churchill's Cold War career, setting aside Fulton and Iron Curtain in 1946, is less well embedded, I think, in popular memory than his World War II career. And that's understandable, I think. 1940 to 45 was pretty epic stuff, I think everybody would agree. But the post-war Churchill deserves our attention, I think, for lots of reasons, although time only permits me to give you one reason this morning, and that is Churchill's emergence, and I would say extraordinary evolution in the decade after 1945 as a nuclear statesman. Now, and remember, by the way, we're dealing here with a Victorian-era cavalry officer trained in, I don't know, lance and horse and revolver and sword, who is dealing by the mid-20th century with weapons of mass destruction that, I'm not a scientist, but I'm pretty sure they kind of draw on the same power that fuels the stars of the night sky. It's a quite extraordinary story in that respect. But let me begin this Churchill evolution in July 1945. It's Potsdam, it's the final Big Three conference of World War II. On the 24th of July, US President Harry S. Truman, with Churchill's entire support, takes aside Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and tells him the United States has just in the last few days tested out in the wilds of New Mexico a new bomb of superlative destructiveness. And that's it. Now that was what we today would call a rather clunky piece of atomic diplomacy. Basically, President Truman said, "Hey Joe, we've got a super bomb, you don't, we don't like what we're doing in Eastern Europe, and you join the dots up."
And Stalin does join the dots up. He goes straight back to his advisors that evening and says, quote, atomic blackmail, unquote, is US policy. And he sets his advisors what he calls task number 1, build me a bomb, ASAP. Now at Potsdam, I think Winston Churchill was an atomic blackmailer, at least in thought, if not actually in deed. On learning of that successful US test, the Trinity test, he was exultant. Here was a lever, he felt, that could be used to prise Eastern Europe from the Soviet Union's grasp. He was all for telling Stalin virtually there and then, and I'm going to quote Churchill now, unless the Red Army was pulled back to barracks in Russia, quote, we will blot out Moscow, then Stalingrad, then Kiev, then Kubyshev, Sevastopol, and now, sort of jutting out his jaw, now where are the Russians? Well, the Conservative defeat in that summer's general election meant that Churchill had no time to properly factor the atomic bomb into his Soviet policy. In opposition, though, Churchill, at least for the first few years, remained, I think, a fairly unashamed atomic diplomatist. In other words, he was a believer in the coercive diplomatic power of the American atomic monopoly to maybe intimidate Stalin into relinquishing control of Eastern Europe, if only President Truman would use that monopoly effectively. But Truman never does. And then we come to 1949. The Soviet Union explodes successfully its first atomic bomb. The American monopoly is finished. Now, the American response to that, Truman's response in January 1950, is a crash program of hydrogen bomb development, the H-bomb, a thermonuclear weapon, which could be, 1,000 times as powerful as the atomic bombs used against Japan. This was quite developed. And it's around then, it's around 1949, 1950, that I see Winston Churchill beginning to shape-shift. He was particularly disturbed by the fact that at that point, Soviet bombers had, and soon to be laden for all he knew of atomic bombs, had the range to reach Britain and Western Europe, but not yet North America. In other words, if this thing called the Cold War pitched into a hot nuclear war, the UK and Western Europe stood to suffer more badly than perhaps the United States would, and that perturbed him. And in February 1950, Churchill called publicly for a summit, a UK, US, Soviet heads of government meeting to explore the potentialities of détente before something went wrong and this thing called the Cold War pitched into some disastrous, now nuclearised hot war. But at that point, neither the US government nor, for that matter, the Labour government at home was that interested in summitry. Churchill would come back as Prime Minister in October 1951. Exactly a year later, October 52, he would become the first Prime Minister in British history to have a nuclear weapon at his disposal when the previous Labour government's atomic bomb project reaches its kind of explosive, successful climax. And boosted by that atomic success, Churchill will again revisit with the US government the idea of a summit, as in his own mind now, not a literal equal, but a notional nuclear equal. Britain's in the A-bomb club now. But at that stage, late 52, the now lame duck Truman Democratic administration is not interested. Then also November 1952, just a month after that British A-bomb triumph, the United States tests its first hydrogen bomb, way out in the distant reaches of the Pacific. It's a monster. It weighs in at 10.4 megatons of TNT destructive equivalence. The British A-bomb was 20 kilotons comparatively. It's as I say, it's huge. It's a monster. And within less than a year, the Soviet Union will have joined this H-bomb club as well. Now, the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower as US President in late 1952 initially encouraged Churchill. He travelled to Washington pre-inauguration, January 53, to reconnect with Ike, to pitch a summit, and also, I think, to revive the special relationship, which he was pretty sure had kind of lapsed and decayed a bit under Labour. Labour hadn't looked after the garden very well. And Eisenhower was really polite and attentive, but entirely non-committal on just about everything that Churchill pitched.
The death of Stalin in March 1953 gives Churchill a fresh opportunity to return to the charge on a summit, but at that stage the US government, the Eisenhower administration, is suspicious of the new leadership in the Kremlin, its own publicly professed support for détente, thinks it's communist propaganda, communist posturing. Churchill was not so sure. He thought, at least let's talk and see what things look like. And entering 1954, so Churchill is approaching 80, so he's an old man in a hurry, and as one might say. Entering 1954, Churchill reluctantly concluded that to add weight to his summit pressure on and in Washington, to be taken more seriously on this issue perhaps, Britain needed to join the H1 Club. Just as important, he felt, if it came to restraining the United States from, say, going nuclear in a crisis in the developing world, for example, and triggering general war, the UK needed the locus standi that possession of a hydrogen bomb might bring in order to talk equal to equal, as it were. I'm quoting Churchill now from the Defence Policy Committee of the Cabinet in June 1954. He said, "Influence in Washington depends on possession of force," quote unquote. And in 1954, the ultimate force was the hydrogen bomb. Churchill was particularly anxious at that stage about a possible collapse of the 1953 Crimean armistice. The war was kind of paused since July 1953. He was anxious because Eisenhower had privately warned him that if the war did reopen, if the communists, wrecked the peace, the United States would hit China directly with nuclear weapons. America would not get involved again in the meat grinder war in the Korean Peninsula itself. Churchill was pretty convinced that if that happened, it would trigger the Sino-Soviet Treaty, and if that happened, we're on the way to general war, general nuclear war, and for all you know, atomic-laden Soviet bombers heading towards US bases in East Anglia, right here, to be honest. So he was very worried about that. And if any crisis went nuclear, because the United States had overreacted, he reminded Eisenhower that if it came to nuclear war, even if some of us in this country, the UK, temporarily survive in some deep cellar under mounds of flaming and contaminated rubble, there'll be nothing left to do but take a pill to end it all. That's quite a powerful statement to make to Eisenhower. My point is that when we come to 1954, Churchill backs a British hydrogen bomb for reasons of national prestige, top table, national security, absolutely, but also to arm the United Kingdom diplomatically against the United States, insofar as he felt the possession of a hydrogen bomb was essential if Britain's cautionary counsel in a crisis was to be not just heard but maybe heeded by the United States at that point. And interestingly, just as I was putting this talk together, I'm nearly done, that kind of American dynamic also featured a little bit in the Labour government's decision to build an atomic bomb in the first place. Many of you will know this, but in 1946, the formidable Ernest Bevin entered the cabinet. There was a number of bomb skeptics in the cabinet, and he wings round those skeptics with reference not to the Soviet enemy but to the American ally. I'm quoting Bevin, 1946, says, "No other foreign secretary should have to sit in front of the US Secretary of State and be talked to as I've just been talked to by James Burns." James Burns, Truman's Secretary of State. "We've got to have this thing over here, whatever it costs. We've got to have the bloody Union Jack on top of it." That's Ernest Bevin. So there's an American angle to the A-bomb and the H-bomb. Containment of the Soviet Union was Britain and the West's policy strategy during the Cold War. But Britain, in its way, was containing America. Churchill was at least seeking ways to counter the "it's just another weapon in the arsenal" mindset that Eisenhower, or his administration in particular, brought to the business of the bomb, capital B. Alan doesn't need to panic, I'm almost done, but I just have to flag just two more things, or two more quotes. Churchill, out of all this, also emerges as an unexpected pioneer of mutual assured destruction. MAD, MAD. A good decade, I'd say, before it becomes common currency. Now, by the mid-50s, Churchill had concluded that a world in which just the USA, just happened to be the USA, possessed a major advantage in nuclear weapons over the Soviet Union, was not necessarily a stable and a safe world. A greater assurance of stability and peace and security would come if there was an equality of mass destruction on both sides. Accordingly, he looked forward to the moment, this is my quote, 1953, when the advance of destructive weapons means that if everyone can kill everybody else, no one will want to kill anyone at all. Now, if that's not mad, the madness of Winston Churchill, I don't know what is. And lastly of all, 1955, his final great set-piece speech in the House of Commons. He sat there, never made another one like this. He chose the hydrogen bomb as his theme. And he told MPs that once America and, this is the great anti-communist, and Russia had the power to destroy one another in equal measure, maybe peace would prevail, he said. And so, quote, by a sublime irony, safety will be the sturdy child of terror, and survival the twin brother of annihilation. And with that, I suggest, Churchill's evolution from coercive atomic diplomatist to nuclear war-fearing proponent of détente, pioneer of MAD, I think the evolution is complete, as I'm pretty sure the 10 minutes is as well.
Thank you, Peter. We're now going to leap forward to the end of the Cold War, to the 1980s, and to the period of another personal special relationship that has inspired interest ever since on both sides of the Atlantic, that between Margaret Thatcher, a child of Grantham, and Ronald Reagan. Chris Collins is undoubtedly one of the world's leading experts on Lady Thatcher. He worked as part of the team that helped her to produce her memoirs. He has published an edition of her complete speeches. He's the creator and editor of the Margaret Thatcher Foundation website, which, if you haven't looked at it, is an amazing resource, far and away the most comprehensive online resource for the study of her life and premiership. And he is currently working on his own book project. Chris will talk to us on America and Americans, Margaret Thatcher's special relationship.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you. Margaret Thatcher was born in 1925, 4 years after the British Empire reached its widest territorial extent. And by the time she became an MP in 1959, it was all gone, pretty nearly, apart from a few pesky, detailed, small pieces that caused lots of trouble. Now, that is an overturning of an epic kind. And the first thing to say about her view of the special relationship is that she is profoundly Churchillian in her view of it. Because what she does is take the way that Churchill spoke about and presented and thought about the overturning of British power and the whole story of the Second World War and the emergence of the special relationship. She takes that as the basis of her whole worldview also. She never steps away from this Churchillian structure. She believes indeed that it must be sustained at all costs. She's a devout believer in its necessity for Britain and the wider world. So for her, there is this sense from the very beginning all through that the special relationship should never be challenged. It is the basis of all. And its roots lie, as Churchill said, in the beginning of 1940, the heroic moment, and the emergence of the relationship through the wartime experience. Now, she isn't distinctive particularly in this. There are many other British politicians who have a very similar view, though she's perhaps more devout. But there is a second thing about her view of the special relationship that is rather distinctive, in fact, possibly even unique, which is that she had a degree of belief in America, an affection, a regard, a respect, that only grew over time. I should name-check Grantham, I know, being here, and it is true that she, like all British people of her generation, was exposed pretty early to American culture through the films. She went to the cinema devotedly in Grantham and was enormously amused, entertained, pleased. She saw the USAF in person when she was a young woman in Grantham as the Americans moved in, the bomber squadron was so close by. She had a lot of exposure, therefore, early on to the United States. And yet the deal wasn't really sealed in her case until in the 1960s. She went on 2 long tours In 1967, under the sponsorship of the State Department that Ambassador Palmer has spent so many years working for, and in 1969 for the English-speaking Union. These tours took her all the way across the United States, not merely to the big cities, but some of the smaller ones and even to rural towns. She spent about 7 or 8 weeks actually simply talking to Americans, meeting people who she would never otherwise have met. And the effect was enormous and enduring. Perhaps the ambassador should mention to the State Department that it was a good investment because it changed her view of America. It established a sort of emotional core to what had previously been an intellectual structure. And it was very important to the future because although there were bonds with people like Ronald Reagan about economy and tax cuts and so on, actually at the root of her bond with Reagan was this belief in America. That was where she came from, as well as him. She had a similar belief in Britain, of course. So that almost literal-minded patriotism is a very important driver for her. And I can't find another British politician of her era who had that feeling. However much they may have believed the same things, they didn't feel the same things as Margaret Thatcher. Now, one then goes on to what you might call the dynamic bit. The relationships with presidents. Every British politician, I think, in her era was doomed to try to get along with presidents. They weren't doomed to succeed because it wasn't in their power necessarily to succeed. And the result is always going to be a rather mixed score. She had 3 presidents to deal with as Prime Minister. Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush Sr. And it's very interesting the way it plays because she had many ways of getting on with people. She was quite a subtle person in her dealings. And with Carter, she actually successfully trades on many of the aspects of her background that came from Grantham. She was a small town girl, he's a small town boy from Plains. She grew up in an unsparing evangelical household, as did he, baptism versus Methodism, but still very similar. She has a scientific education. You can see that if Carter had actually won the next presidential election in 1980 and had been a 2-term president, actually there might have been a very successful relationship between them. They had emerged in many ways as successful partners, if not getting on terribly well emotionally, then doing very good business together by the time he left office. And it was not unhelpful to her, in fact, that Carter quarrelled with virtually everyone else in Europe. He had a terrible relationship with Helmut Schmidt, absolutely dreadful, and scarcely better with Giscard in France. So she was actually able to trade rather successfully on being the only person who could, more or less, actually talk to him without getting into a fight. However, he fades away, he's off the scene, and Reagan becomes president. And her relationship with Reagan is really very interesting because they are, of course, much less similar than she was with Carter. Much less similar. I mean, she had much more in common with Carter because here is Reagan, the sunny, optimistic Californian, at least, emigrated to California in early life, the film star, the man who doesn't do detail, who, in fact, is in many respects a very person that she would regard as a bad minister. She would never have appointed him to run part of her government because he is simply unable really to focus on the kinds of things that she thought essential in terms of grasping a policy and really understanding it. He's not at all like that. After the first meeting she had with him as president, she turned to her foreign secretary, Lord Carrington, and said, "There's not much between the ears." That's what she said about Reagan. So never think that it's all sunny and wonderful and she thinks it's absolutely fantastic. However, from 1975, when the first letter that Ronald Reagan writes to her is survived, they had this bond about the vital importance of beating the dragon of decline, if you can put it that way. Both nations appeared to be in decline. Reagan felt this very, very deeply. She felt it about Britain, and this was the bond created by this joint belief that each had in their own nation and that she had in the United States. It is far more important free market economics than tax cuts, voluntarism, any of these matters, where in fact they quite often disagree. But they agreed about this. They had to pull it round. This was essential to the West. They had to pull it off. They had to convince people there was a future, that this was going to work. And she's therefore actually enormously pleased when Reagan's elected. It takes a time for his presidency and her premiership to go in sync. The Falklands, which I'm now writing my book about, was actually a quite low point in the relationship between them. She was furious with the United States for trying to be even-handed between Britain and the junta at the beginning of the conflict. That phase ended, but nonetheless, it was to her unbearable and impossible to understand that the democracy was put on the same level as the dictatorship, for reasons connected to Central America, where the US was employing the junta to fight against the Sandinistas. But it turns round. She becomes very vehement in her dealings with Ronald Reagan, and he actually rather accepts this. There was a phone call in May 1982 when she just talks and talks and talks, and he could barely get a word in. If you read the transcript, the American transcript in the Reagan Library, he would just have a half sentence. Yes, Margaret, I rather think that, and then there'd be another paragraph in there, and he'd say, well, you might be right, Margaret, a huge wad. And this is the call where there were many other people in the room, of course, at the time. And after a bit of this, he realises how it's going to go. He rolls the phone out from the room so they can hear again. He mouths the words, "Isn't she wonderful?" And the basis, in fact, in many ways for their relationship was the extraordinary self-confidence he had and the willingness just to accept what many politicians with thinner skins would actually resent mightily. He almost enjoyed being told off by Margaret Thatcher. And she supplied a fair amount of that in years to come, because she began to realise actually this did work, that she could be the one who did the talking. And while he deeply believed in the things he deeply believed in many respects the detail didn't bother him, and she would run it. It's a curious thing, and it wasn't going to work for any other relationship between a president and prime minister. There's something very unusual about that, and it reflects more Reagan than her. She plays a very large part in the emergence of Gorbachev as an interlocutor for the West, and that is one of her greatest claims to fame in terms of the relationship with Reagan, because she does everything she can to persuade him that there should be a tilt away from the really dark days of the Cold War in 1982-83, the Soviet leadership failing. She also uses the very fortunate fact that we had acquired a Soviet defector in the form of Oleg Gordievsky. And he had come up with intelligence that showed that the Soviets seriously feared a Western first strike. Astonishing, you couldn't believe it at first. She persuades Reagan this is true. She takes the intelligence. Gordievsky's a feather in our intelligence cap, and it's a serious piece of information, and she persuades the president. They really are scared of us. You begin to see a whole new dynamic. So she has a part in kicking off this relationship with Gorbachev, which then, of course, has a life of its own. I'm not suggesting she pulls the strings during that model. There were then these marvellous and extraordinary summits that begin to wind down the Cold War. Bush succeeds. 1989, January 89, he takes the presidency, and immediately things begin to be more difficult for her. She can't replicate the Reagan relationship. She can't do with Bush and doesn't try to talk him off the floor. And even so, he's very uncomfortable with her. He's not at all the same kind of person. He is somebody who, as vice president, had the struggle of living under the shadow of a conservative icon, if I could put it that way. He found that very difficult. He wants to be his own man, and one of the things he wants to do is to make sure that Mrs. Thatcher understands her place. This is one way of becoming his own man, to put the British in that place a bit through her. She finds this enormously uncomfortable. Nonetheless, it's by no means the end of the road for the special relationship, and she labours mightily to keep it going, with great success. And as the ambassadors mentioned, there are aspects of this, levels of it, vast numbers of officials working, huge bits of bureaucracy. It runs along, even if the President and Prime Minister aren't getting on every single day of the week, in every single conversation. She does important things in this relationship, particularly in 1989, when the Bush administration, as part of its rethink, put distance with Gorbachev. She was horrified to see that Gorbachev was being left out, and did everything she could to get Gorbachev into Washington, back into the agenda of the administration, because they had this very strange hiatus. She is wrong-footed by unification in Germany, but the Gulf War in August 1990 produces a tremendous reversion to the special relationship at its height, and she is suddenly introduced into the White House in meetings with the chiefs of staff, with the National Security Council, almost as if she wasn't a foreign head of government at all. She was very struck. She never had this with Reagan, actually. She was never treated quite as an insider the way she was in those last few months. So, in a sense, this vindicates the point about the special relationship, that it can withstand all sorts of vicissitudes and difficulties and reverts naturally almost into a position. Wrapping up, the post-premiership is interesting as well. It's part of this story. Charles Powell, Mrs. Thatcher's longest and most powerful foreign policy advisor, has said that she had no happy day after she was Prime Minister. As soon as she was out of office, really, it was all rather sad. There's a lot of truth in it, I think. But she was happiest in the US. I have no doubt about that. I was working for her at this time, 4 years seeing a lot of her, and the US was where she was most at home. That regard, that belief in the United States burned ever brighter. She spent more time there than she had ever before, and almost as much time as she spent in the United Kingdom. And the love began to flow in both directions. She got an audience in the US that she didn't get in Britain, and an admiration, respect, and outright love sometimes that actually really was comforting to her in those years. She was enormously pleased to receive it, comforted, and it was really an anchor to her in those last days. So this then was Mrs. Thatcher's special relationship, special indeed, no inverted commas needed. More special perhaps, I think, than for any British PM, other than Churchill.
We are overrunning a little bit. This is what happens when you get 4 university people on a panel. The panel after the tea break, which is politicians and military figures, will run much more to time, I'm sure. But we do still have a few minutes for some questions. So I'm going to go straight out to the floor, and we've got a question for this gentleman over here.
This is for Professor Ruin. I'm a Missourian, and I'd like to know more about President Harry Truman, his relationship with Churchill, and also his relationship with the Labour government after Churchill got out of office.
Okay, I'll ask you a question in the break as well, so I want to know why the story's called Show Me State, but we'll pick it up. If I go back to the death of Roosevelt in April 1945, I think Winston Churchill rather regretted not going to that funeral. He had various reasons, and lots of people can produce their own reasons why he didn't go. It was very unusual. But later on, he rather regretted not just saying goodbye to his old ally, his old chum, but getting to know Truman. So really the first time they meet is at Potsdam. And I think it was very easy for a lot of people to underestimate Harry Truman. I've got a great deal of respect for Harry Truman. And I think you see that happen. You see that growing on Churchill's part. Churchill's in opposition, obviously, from July 1945 onwards, but you'll have him writing to Truman regarding the Marshall Plan, thanking him from the bottom of his heart for doing so much to regenerate Europe and help Western Europe at such a crucial moment. Churchill will be back in office in 1951, by which stage Truman is sort of a veteran president at this point. And Churchill will have he'll visit Truman in January 1952, and that's a point where I think the special relationship, the imbalance in power is now even more glaring than it was in the back end of the war. But Churchill respects, likes, admires what Truman has done, knows that Truman had a really, really tough transition, having to fill those boots of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And indeed, I mentioned it in my talk, I'm going to give somebody else a chance now, but when Ike is elected, Churchill goes straight across the Atlantic. He wants to meet Eisenhower before he's inaugurated. He wants to get in first to set the agenda a little bit. But he really, really wants to say goodbye to Harry S. Truman as well. And so I think there's some real
I think Truman goes out of his way to cultivate Churchill. And of course it's Churchill who really brings, it's Truman who really brings Churchill back onto the world stage after Churchill's 1945 election defeat by bringing him to Fulton Auxiliary. We have in the archive the invitation letter to Churchill to deliver that speech. He's getting lots of these sorts of invitations at that point, but this one comes with a very particular codicil. At the bottom of the letter is written, "This is a wonderful college in my home state. If you come, I'll introduce you, Harry S. Truman." Okay, we're looking for further questions. So we've got Paul Robinson here, and then one opposite.
Hello, I'm Paul Robinson. I'm very interested in the impact on the special relationship of the 1946 Manor Act, which rather upset the Manhattan Programme, which had been driven, of course, by the US, but also with major British and Canadian participation. And to have one's access to nuclear technology cut off quite so abruptly after the war must have had a big impact. Now, of course, it all came good in the end, and the result is the trident systems that we have at the moment and many others. Nevertheless, that must have hurt. Could you explain a little bit more about that, please?
I think this is probably another one for you, Kevin.
I think Churchill, before he loses the election, and then the Labour government takes over, because Attlee was in the know as well, rather hoped that the special nuclear relationship that had developed during the Second World War and was rooted in two particular agreements, the Quebec Agreement 1943, Hyde Park Agreement 1944, would be the basis for post-war Anglo-American nuclear cooperation. But what you find by 1946, whatever the Truman administration might have wanted, the US Congress, in a kind of, a spasm of nuclear proprietorialness, if that's the right word, feeling that since the bomb was funded 90% by US taxpayers and the United States in the Manhattan Project, 90% of everything into it by the end, the British contribution was significant, but the American contribution was overwhelming. That also you've got the evolving Cold War climate at the moment, and the US Congress with the McMahon Act, which goes live on 1st of January 1947, slams the door shut. And the Labour government has only just at that point decided that we ought to go for an atomic bomb ourselves. There were hopes that something called international control of atomic energy might kick in. The United Nations might look after this awesome new power source, but that wasn't working out. And so there is no doubt that that was a tremendous blow. That for the next 4 or 5 or 6 years of terrible austerity still, the UK is motoring, or pootling, not motoring, towards its own atomic destiny. And it's having to undergo experiments, it's having to do very, very costly, complex processes to discover things that, if they were able to ask the Americans, so we tried that last week, it doesn't work, save yourself £1 million, don't worry about it. It was a tremendous blow. There was a moment around about 1949 going into 1950 when it looked like maybe Britain would get some kind of special exemption from the McMahon Act and be brought in as a sort of a special atomic ally. And then somebody called Klaus Fuchs pops up. So Klaus Fuchs is exposed as the great atomic spy. And I'm afraid just as Klaus Fuchs' prison doors slammed shut, so the United States slammed shut that little chink of possibility that the UK would get back in. It all comes right in the end, as you know, but in 1957, I think, really, under William and Eisenhower before, nuclear relations were restored in that kind of meaningful interchange of information sets.
Churchill was furious when he found out about the McMahon Act. Now, do we have a question for James or Chris? Okay.
Not specifically, but more generally to the whole panel. The question really is about intelligence sharing as a part of the special relationship. By way of example, in February 1941, the first Americans come across Britain, go to Bletchley Park, and they share with the Brits what they're doing about signals intelligence. This is, of course, 10 months before America joins the war. That relationship is enshrined in the Bruiser Act in 1943 and eventually in Nicosia in 1946. And of course continues today with cooperation between GCHQ and NSA. I wonder if you'd like to comment on how important you think intelligence sharing has been to that special relationship.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to speak for the whole panel. I suspect we're all going to agree that it was incredibly important. Certainly my own research into D-Day and the intelligence sharing and the perception work, which is of course the other side of that emerges around D-Day, is hugely significant. But James, do you want to come on this?
Well, just briefly, I think what intelligence probably is strangely enough, the one thing where it comes across from the British side that they do have quite a lot of trust, which I think almost seems like it should be bizarrely the other way around. The areas of mistrust tend to be in things that should be much more straightforward, because they fear duplicitousness in those areas. Now, I'm not suggesting that intelligence sharing is kind of an open door, because I think we all know that's not true. But when intelligence is talked about, it's obvious that it is, how can I put it? It is tremendously, it's a given that this, the sharing of intelligence is sort of the cornerstone that they keep coming back to.
Chris, do you want to come in on?
Yes, I can say that. I think over the period that we've been discussing here, SIGINT, signals intelligence, and decryption becomes more and more important. And there, actually, one of the most useful things in the relationship is that Britain has a lot more to give than it does militarily. We're not a large power by the standards of the US in terms of armies and air forces and so on, but we are a large power in intelligence terms. The money was well spent for those guys in Cheltenham, especially. So it is an interesting and a very important aspect, but of course also very difficult to assess for reasons that are obvious. We won't actually see the full picture till the full picture as well in review, and the further you get up to the present, the more difficult it is.
Okay, well, I think we need to bring this session to a close. To do that, I just want to give each of our panellists a chance to answer a question from me. A lot of this conversation and the presentations is focused on individuals. We talked a lot about Churchill and Roosevelt, about Attlee and Truman, about Thatcher and Reagan. And I just wondered how much of this does come down to personalities. What role do they really play? How much of it is really the underlying structures that are created through the national interests?
Well, I think personalities are important, but and they're important at a hidden level as well, because there's lots of, in my talk, it's really about civil servants speaking to each other and their relationships that they forged before and after the war. But I think actually the thing that underscores the special relationship and any sort of close relationship between allies in the material that I work on is actually how successful you are at understanding the political culture of the people you're dealing with. And the British civil service are not marvellous at that in the period we're looking at. And I think as they go on, they become a bit more adroit at understanding their American counterparts and who they can communicate with and how you can talk to people in ways that are productive over time. So I think the answer is yes, absolutely, and we all enjoy hearing about Churchill and Roosevelt and things like that. But the key is that grasping of the political culture, and that takes a great deal of work.
Okay.
Yeah, just briefly, I've been looking at this magnificent chandelier. It's over all your heads, but I'm looking at it here. And that's like presidents and the prime ministers. That's the thing that you see. It's glowing, it's massive, it's in your face. But what about the hidden wiring? What about the stuff that you can't see behind the scenes? And I'm just going to echo what's been said. Presidents and prime ministers come and go, but I think there are special relationships within the framework of the special relationship. One of those is the intelligence community special relationship. I think that we can't get to see that in any real sense, but you kind of know it's there. And I've picked up over the years that no matter how rocky things might be at the highest political level, Heath and Nixon, for example, or Wilson and LBJ, the thing that's keeping the special relationship going is the civil servants. It is the career foreign service officers. It is the intelligence community that, are doing their job day in, day out, producing this kind of bonding agent that keeps this remarkable relationship going. Prime ministers, presidents, we look at them, they've got the front row, but there's a lot more to it.
Thank you. I think I would echo almost all of that. It's obviously both that matter. It's structure, it's also the relationships between individuals. And perhaps I'd add just one thing, the belief that politicians have about the structure and about the countries. That is the thing that I have tried to focus on a bit here, and I think it is something we do neglect a bit. The view that British people have about America, the politicians, particularly themselves, that influences things very much too. That changes over time, and different people have different views, but it's separate from personality. So we need to think more about that.
Okay, and I think that, I hope, sets us up perfectly for the next panel after the break, where we'll be looking at some of the contemporary challenges facing the relationship. But thank you all very much, and I want to thank particularly our three panellists, Chris, Kevin and James, and we now have a 20-minute break. Thank you.